Lois laughed right in my face the moment I got down on one knee and opened the ring box. You? Proposing to me? James, don't embarrass yourself. Her voice was loud enough for the whole rooftop to hear. I looked up at her, my heart pounding. Not from nerves anymore, but from humiliation. I thought My voice cracked. She shook her head with a smirk, brushing her long hair behind her ear. You thought wrong. I never saw you that way. You're just a boring nobody. What? Do you even have to offer? I stood up slowly, closing the ring box with trembling fingers. My co-workers, the event planners, the string quartet, all of them watched silently. The giant LED sign behind her that read, "Lois, will you marry me?" kept flashing, like it was mocking me too. But Lois didn't stop there. You don't even have a car worth showing off. Your salary's laughable. You think love is enough? She tilted her head, eyes gleaming with cruelty. Now, if it were someone like Clark, I might have thought about it. At least he makes headlines. Clark, the idol she obsessed over. National treasure. I had spent months preparing this, thinking she loved me back, and she compared me to him. People were murmuring behind us now, some with pity, some trying to hide their laughter. Lois leaned in and whispered, "It's honestly cute that you tried, but I don't date losers. Be grateful I didn't post this online." My ears rang. My hands were numb, but I smiled. Not the kind of smile you give when you're happy. The kind you make when something inside you breaks clean in two. I nodded once and said calmly, "You're right." Then I turned around and left, her standing there under the glittering lights in front of the crowd she thought she owned. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't drink. I didn't even feel anger. I just made a single phone call to the one person who could change everything. And the very next day, the whole country watched as I stood on a grander stage, holding a different ring. This time, placing it on the finger of someone the world thought was untouchable. Lois watched it too. She choked on her pride as the camera zoomed in on my lips, saying the words, "Ruth, will you marry me?" I met Lois during my final year in university. She wasn't just the campus beauty, she was the kind of girl everyone remembered after one glance. Gorgeous, confident, charming. And somehow she chose to sit beside me on the first day of class. I still remember how she laughed when I dropped my pen and scrambled to catch it before it rolled under her desk. "You're clumsy," she teased, handing it back. "But kind of cute." That moment became the start of everything. At first, I couldn't believe she'd even talk to someone like me. While she shined under the spotlight, hosting school events, winning brand ambassadorships, getting sponsorship deals, I stayed in the background, managing a part-time job and maintaining decent grades. She called me old-fashioned because I preferred reading over partying, and I called her chaotic because she never planned anything more than an hour ahead. We were opposites, but maybe that's why we fit. Or maybe I was just too blind to see what she really thought of me. I took her out whenever I saved up enough. Never to luxury spots, just quiet restaurants, late-night drives, watching city lights while sharing cheap takeout. I thought those moments meant something to her. I thought that smile she gave me while sipping milk tea in my jacket was real. I thought the nights we stayed up talking about dreams were honest. She told me she hated flashy guys, that men like Clark were unreachable and not her type. I believed her. Even after we graduated, I stayed by her side. She got a job as an influencer's assistant, and I landed an entry-level design job at a firm. We moved to the city together. I paid most of the rent while she chased her dreams, and I didn't complain when she borrowed money or forgot to split bills. I worked overtime, brought her food during shoots, listened to her rant about photographers and brand managers. When she cried because she lost a gig to another model, I held her. When she doubted herself, I reassured her. When she said she felt worthless, I reminded her how amazing she was. But she never once said she loved me. Still, I kept hoping that one day she'd stop calling me her best friend in front of others, that she'd stop hiding me like I was something to be ashamed of. That maybe, just maybe, she'd finally see me as more. The truth started creeping in slowly, like rot under fresh paint. The way she'd glance at men in expensive suits when we were out. The subtle eye rolls when I talked about saving for a date. House. The way she compared me to Clark whenever he was on TV. See how well he speaks? She'd say. You should try dressing like that. Imagine being with someone like him. I laughed it off at first. I thought she didn't mean it. Until one night, I overheard her talking to her friend on the phone. She was in the kitchen, and I was in the hallway. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but her words sliced through me anyway. James? He's sweet, yeah. But honestly, I could never date him seriously. He's just average. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself maybe I misunderstood. Maybe she was just venting. Maybe she didn't mean it. But after that, I started seeing everything for what it was. She liked having me around when she was sad, when she needed help, when she wanted comfort. But when she was smiling and dressed up, she left me behind. I wasn't her boyfriend. I was her backup, her emotional support. Her placeholder, and I was stupid enough to accept that role. But something in me changed when I saw her get invited to Clark's private birthday gala. She came home glowing, talking about how charming he was, how close they got, how he even remembered her name. I smiled and listened. But that night, I stayed awake staring at the ceiling, clutching the ring I had already bought. I was planning to propose. Why? Even now I'm not sure. Maybe because I thought if I gave everything, she'd finally choose me. That all the years I stayed by her side would mean something, so I went ahead with it. I booked the rooftop, arranged everything down to the second, made sure her favorite flowers were lined along the railing. I invited all our friends. I even practiced my lines in front of the mirror. She walked in wearing a white dress, smiling like she owned the night. And then she crushed me in front of everyone. The worst part wasn't the rejection. It was the laughter. The way her lips curled when she said, "James, you can't seriously think I'd say yes." Like it was the most ridiculous idea in the world. That was the moment I knew I was never enough for her. Not because I lacked something, but because she never looked at me with real eyes. She saw what she wanted, a safe place to fall when things got hard, a loyal shadow to lean on, but I wasn't going to be anyone's shadow anymore. So when she mocked my proposal that night, I walked away without another word, and the next time she saw me, I wasn't the same man she once thought she could use. The day after she humiliated me on the rooftop, I didn't show up to work. I couldn't. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over. Her laughter, her voice laced with scorn, the way our friends awkwardly looked away as if my pain was something to be pitied, the way she smirked as if she'd done me a favor by saying no. James, you? Seriously? It echoed in my ears like a curse. I ignored the calls, the messages, even the one from her that said, "Hey, I didn't mean to embarrass you. You just caught me off guard. Let's talk?" Caught her off guard? That was rich, she knew. She'd seen me rehearsing my speech, arranging everything to the smallest detail. She had accepted the invite knowing what was coming. She came anyway. Worse, she dressed up for it, and she destroyed me in front of everyone. I got up, splashed water on my face, and stared at my reflection. I didn't recognize the man looking back. Tired eyes, lips pressed too tightly, fists clenched like they'd forgotten how to relax. I had spent years trying to become someone she'd be proud to stand next to, but nothing I did was ever enough. Around noon, I finally checked my messages. Dozens of texts from people asking if I was okay, if I needed anything. Even Clark had sent one, short, polite, forgettable, typical. But one message stood out. It wasn't from Lois. It was from Ruth. I saw what happened. Call me if you need to breathe. Ruth. Quiet, reserved, always in the background. She'd worked with Lois briefly during a brand collab shoot, and that's how we met. We hadn't spoken in months, but I remembered how calm her energy was. She never tried too hard, never showed off. Just observed. Unlike Lois, who lit up rooms just to make sure everyone noticed her. Something about Ruth's message felt grounding. I didn't reply. Not yet. That night, I went for a walk to clear my head. My phone buzzed again. Lois. Hey, Clark invited me to his villa party tomorrow. Come with? It'll be fun. Fresh air might do you good. I froze. She wanted me to go to Clark's party the day after she rejected my proposal, like nothing had happened. Like I was supposed to follow her around like a loyal pet, smiling politely while she tried to impress the man she really wanted. I felt something snap inside me. I didn't respond. I turned off my phone and walked home in silence. The next day, I found out through mutual friends that she showed up at the villa dressed like she was walking a red carpet. Clark gave her a tour personally, introduced her to his friends. And at one point, according to someone who was there, she leaned into him laughing, brushing imaginary lint off his jacket like she belonged to him. No shame, no hesitation, no trace of what she'd done to me 24 hours earlier. It was as if our years together were a joke to her. A long, boring chapter she was glad to close now that she had access to something better. That night, Ruth messaged again. I heard she went to Clark's villa. You doing okay? I stared at the message for a long time. And then, for the first time in days, I replied, Can we meet? She responded almost instantly. Of course. We met at a quiet cafe near the old library. Ruth wore a simple beige sweater and no makeup. She looked at me the way no one had all week, not with pity, not with judgment, just calm understanding. You don't need to talk, she said, sliding a cup of hot tea toward me. Not unless you want to. But I did. I wanted to say everything. And for the next hour, I did. I told her everything, how it started, how I kept hoping Lois would see me, how I planned the proposal, and how she crushed it like it was nothing. How she left for Clark's party without a second thought. How I felt like I'd wasted years of my life. Ruth didn't interrupt. She didn't try to fix it. She just listened, and when I was done, she looked at me and said something that stuck with me. Sometimes people like Lois don't want love. They want worship. I blinked. She doesn't want a partner, James. She wants a fan. Someone to admire her from below, not stand beside her. Those words hit me like a freight train. I sat there in silence, the tea growing cold in front of me. And then Ruth leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady. You gave her years of your life, she said. Now give yourself a chance. Do something that doesn't revolve around her. I nodded slowly. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't break down. I just sat with the truth. Lois didn't reject me because I wasn't enough. She rejected me because I stopped making her feel like a star. She didn't want love. She wanted a mirror. And now that I was broken, I no longer reflected the image she craved. The worst part? She wasn't even trying to hide it. I couldn't sleep. Even when I closed my eyes, her voice would slice through the silence, sharp and mocking. James? You? Seriously? Over and over, like a knife twisting deeper each time. I would have taken anger, fury, anything. But what I felt was something worse. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left nothing behind. The air in my apartment felt heavier now. Every corner reminded me of her. The couch where we used to sit for hours talking about dreams we never meant to chase. The coffee table where I placed the velvet ring box the night before the rooftop proposal, believing I was finally enough. How stupid could I be? I should have known. The signs were all there. Every time I told her I was working overtime to save up for our future, she'd just sigh and say, Clark doesn't need to work so hard. Everything just flows to him. When I surprised her with a necklace I designed myself, she smiled. But the next day, I saw her post a photo wearing the diamond choker Clark had gifted her sister. Just trying it on, she said. But I knew better. Still, I stayed. Because I loved her. Or maybe I loved the version of her I had built in my head, and now, Now that version was dead, but the worst part wasn't the rejection. It wasn't even her running off to Clark the very next day. It was the fact that she looked happy. Photos from the villa party had started circulating online. Lois laughing beside Clark, sipping champagne, standing next to his luxury sports car like she already owned the seat beside him, not a trace of regret, not a single crack in her glow. I had deleted the apps from my phone, but friends kept sending me screenshots, tagging me, asking, "Dude, are you okay?" And I hated it. I hated that I had become a pity story, the guy who got played in front of everyone and just disappeared, but disappearing felt like the only thing I could do right now. I stopped going to work. I stopped answering calls. I barely ate. I just sat on my balcony, staring out at the city like maybe the answers were hidden in the buildings or the streetlights. But nothing ever came. Just more silence. And in that silence, I started questioning everything. Was I really unworthy? Was I boring? Plain? Forgettable? Had all my effort, my loyalty, my love really meant nothing? One night, it rained hard. I stood out in it barefoot, letting the cold water soak me. I wanted to feel something, anything. I wanted to shake off the numbness. But even then, all I felt was a dull ache in my chest. That's when Ruth messaged again. "Hey, you don't have to talk, but I'm outside with your favorite takeout. I'll leave it at the door." I opened the door 5 minutes later, and she was still standing there, umbrella in one hand, a paper bag in the other. She looked up at me, completely unfazed by the storm. "You looked like someone who needed warm food." And just like that, something shifted. Not dramatically, not like in the movies, but subtly, quietly. She stepped inside, placed the food on the table, and sat across from me like she belonged there. No questions, no pushing, just presence. We didn't talk much that night. But the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy. It was healing. Over the next few days, she kept showing up, sometimes with food, sometimes with books. Once, she brought her sketch pad and just drew while I sat next to her, sipping tea in silence. She never talked about Lois unless I brought it up, and when I did, she just listened. No judgment, no fake sympathy, just quiet strength. I remember one night when I finally asked her, "Do you think I wasn't good enough for her?" She looked at me for a long moment before saying, "No, I think you were too real for someone who lives off illusions." That hit harder than anything. Because she was right. Lois didn't want real. She wanted glamour, applause, a man who fit the image she had of herself, not someone who would see her at her worst and stay. The pain didn't vanish overnight. Some nights I still found myself staring at my phone, wondering if I should block her. Other nights I read old messages and wondered if there was something I missed, some clue that could have warned me. But every time Ruth sat beside me, reminding me of what peace felt like, a little bit of that hurt melted away. The suspense of what Lois would do next still lingered. Would she come back around when Clark lost interest? Would she message me, pretending nothing ever happened? Would I be stupid enough to answer? That question haunted me most, because part of me, ashamed as I was, still missed her. But every time Ruth smiled gently and said, "One day this won't hurt anymore," I started to believe it. Just a little. It had been a month, a whole month since Lois had laughed in my face, told me I wasn't worthy, and walked right into Clark's world like she'd been waiting for the right excuse to upgrade. And in that time, I'd managed to stand up again. Not fully, maybe not even halfway, but enough to breathe without choking on my own heartbreak. Ruth had helped. She didn't patch the wound, but she stopped it from bleeding. I was finally working again, quietly rebuilding the pieces of my life, when I got the invite, a gold-trimmed envelope, embossed lettering. At first, I thought it was some corporate event, but when I opened it, my hands went cold. "You are cordially invited to Clark Langston's birthday gala, hosted by Lois. Formal attire required." I stared at the card for a full minute, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Lois had invited me. Why? Why would she do that? To gloat? To see if I'd still come crawling? Or was it just some sick game to parade her upgrade in front of the man she humiliated? I wanted to rip the invitation apart, burn it, forget it. But I couldn't. I couldn't ignore it. Because deep down, some part of me needed closure, needed to face her and see with my own eyes that it was over. When I told Ruth, she just watched me quietly and asked, "Are you going?" I said nothing. She didn't stop me. Instead, she said, "Then go, but promise me something." What? Don't go there to break. Go there to end it. The night of the gala arrived, and I dressed carefully. Black tux, polished shoes. I didn't want to impress them. I just wanted to look like someone who had survived. When I walked into the ballroom, it was already buzzing. Chandeliers glittered above, laughter echoed, and luxury dripped from every corner. Then I saw her, Lois. Stunning, as always. Dressed in a champagne-colored gown, her hair curled perfectly, a glass of wine in her hand. And beside her, Clark. Grinning, arrogant, basking in attention like he was born to own the room. They saw me almost instantly. Lois's smile faltered for a second before she masked it. She walked over slowly, Clark watching from a distance, eyes sharp. "James," she said, tilting her head. "Didn't think you'd show up." I forced a smile. "Didn't think I'd be invited." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I thought it would be mature, to leave things civil." I nodded slowly. "Right, civil. Like mocking someone's proposal in public?" Her smile tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she leaned in closer and whispered, "Clark is planning to propose tonight." I blinked, caught off guard. "And you're telling me this? Why?" She looked away, her voice softer. "Just thought you should know, before you hear it from someone else." That's when I realized. She wasn't happy. Not really. There was a stiffness in her posture, a flicker of something uncertain behind her eyes. Lois, who had always been radiant and confident, suddenly looked like someone trying too hard to pretend. "Congratulations," I said, voice calm. "You finally got what you wanted," she blinked. "Don't be like that." I didn't reply. Instead, I turned to leave. But before I could take more than 2 steps, Clark approached. "Hey, buddy," he said, clapping me on the shoulder with that smug grin. "Thanks for coming. Means a lot." I stared at his hand. "You and I aren't friends, Clark." He raised an eyebrow. "Come on, no hard feelings, right? Lois just made a choice, it's not personal." It was everything personal, but I didn't show it. "I hope she was worth it," I said simply. "I really do." And then I walked away. That should have been it. But just as I reached the other end of the hall, a familiar voice stopped me cold. "James?" I turned, and my breath caught. Ruth. Dressed in a midnight blue gown, hair pinned back, eyes wide as she stared at me across the ballroom. What are you doing here?" I asked, stunned. She held up her invitation. "One of my gallery clients," insisted I attend, "said I'd meet some elite investors. Didn't know this was that kind of party." She walked up to me slowly. Then her eyes flicked to where Lois and Clark were still standing. "You okay?" I nodded. "Yeah, now I am." She smiled gently. "Let's get out of here." We didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't look back. But as we stepped into the night, I glanced over my shoulder one last time and caught Lois staring at us. Her hand still resting on Clark's arm, her expression unreadable. But I saw it, just for a second. A flicker of something, raw regret, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of my turn. The media was buzzing the next morning. Photos of me and Ruth leaving Clark's gala together were all over social media. Some blurred, some in full high-res shots, me holding her hand, her smiling, both of us stepping into the same black car, and Lois. She saw everything. Because not even 20 minutes after the posts went viral, she called me. I didn't pick up, she called again. Still nothing. By the third call, I blocked her number. I thought she'd stop, but she didn't. She showed up at my office, bursting through the glass doors, ignoring the receptionist's protests, walking straight into my meeting. Like she still had a place in my life. Everyone in the room froze, and I didn't even stand up. Lois stood there, chest heaving slightly, eyes wide, hair perfectly styled, but her composure was cracked. Thin, almost see-through. "James," she said, trying to sound calm, but her voice wavered. "We need to talk." I turned to my assistant. "Clear the room." They all scrambled out quickly, the tension slicing the air clean in two. When the last person shut the door, I stood up and faced her. "What do you want?" I asked. She flinched at the coldness in my tone. Her fingers trembled as she tucked her hair behind her ear. "I made a mistake," she said softly. I stared at her. "I know I hurt you," she continued, voice cracking now. I thought Clark was what I needed. Stability, fame. But last night, when I saw you with her, I realized I was wrong." She took a step closer. "You proposed to me. You gave me your heart, and I threw it away like it meant nothing. But when I saw you with Ruth, smiling, at peace, it broke me, because I knew that peace used to be mine." I didn't speak. I wanted to feel anger, hatred, but all I felt was emptiness. 4 months ago, I would have given anything to hear her say these words. Now they meant nothing. "You said I wasn't worthy," I replied, my voice low. "You humiliated me, mocked me, told me you'd rather marry a stranger than be with someone like me." She shook her head, eyes already wet. "I was scared. You loved me so purely, so deeply. And I didn't know how to handle it. Clark was easy. He never asked for anything real. You did. And Her voice broke. "I didn't think I deserved that kind of love." I laughed bitterly. "You didn't?" Her tears finally spilled. "I can make it right," she whispered. I left him. I told Clark last night that it's over. I don't want a man who's only charming in front of cameras. I want the man who jumped in front of a car to protect my drunk brother. The one who used to bring me soup when I was sick. The one who waited 3 hours in the rain just to walk me home. I want you. I shook my head. I'm not yours to want anymore. She looked stunned, like those words had never occurred to her before. You don't mean that. I do. James, please, I'm engaged to Ruth, she gasped. What? I nodded. You were too busy climbing your ladder to notice, but Ruth was there when I hit rock bottom. She held me together when I was falling apart. She didn't need a proposal in front of an audience. She said yes before I even asked. Lois looked like someone had just slapped her. She's not me, she said, voice rising in panic. She doesn't know you like I do. No, I said, eyes locked on hers. She's better. She staggered back a step. I walked toward the door and opened it. This is over, Lois. Whatever we were, it ended the day you mocked the man who loved you. I love you now, she said, desperate. Can't that be enough? It's too late. She stood there for a moment, breathing hard, trying to form words. Then she dropped her gaze and walked out. I didn't watch her go. I closed the door behind her. Later that night, Ruth and I had dinner at her place. She lit candles, soft jazz, played in the background, and her dog curled up on the couch like always. She wore my hoodie, even though it was too big for her, and cooked her signature creamy garlic pasta, the one dish I never got tired of. Halfway through dinner, she looked at me and asked, You saw her, didn't you? I nodded. She came to my office, said she left Clark. Ruth didn't flinch, didn't look away. And what did you say to her? I took her hand and squeezed it gently. I said she was too late. Ruth smiled, softly, not smugly. And that's when I knew. This was where I was always meant to be, not chasing the woman who loved attention more than love itself, but sitting across from the one who didn't need a grand stage to see my worth. The next day, Lois posted a long statement online, something about personal growth, healing, accountability. She didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew. I didn't comment, didn't like it, didn't share it. I was too busy building a life where I was seen, valued, respected. We announced our engagement 2 weeks later, Ruth in a soft pink dress, me in a slate gray suit. No big crowd, just us, close friends, and the people who never laughed at my dreams. Lois saw the photos. She didn't comment either, but I heard she cried when she did, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. The day of the wedding came quicker than anyone expected. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't filled with celebrities or red carpets or flashy news vans, but it was real, quiet, warm, and intimate. Ruth looked breathtaking. She had picked a pale ivory dress with embroidered silver leaves that shimmered like moonlight. Her veil was simple, her makeup light. But the way she looked at me when she walked down the aisle, like I was the only man who ever existed, that made her the most beautiful woman in the world. As she reached me, she whispered, "You sure about this?" I smiled. I've never been more sure of anything. Everyone stood. The vows were exchanged. Rings were slipped onto fingers. And when the priest said, "You may now kiss the bride," I kissed Ruth like I had waited 1,000 lifetimes just for this one moment. There was no trembling, no doubts, no regret, just peace. And that peace was louder than any revenge. But the universe, it seems, still wanted closure. 3 days after the wedding, I received an invitation in my mailbox. No name, just a high-end cream envelope with gold trim. I opened it, Clark's engagement announcement. He was engaged again, but not to Lois. To a woman named Isabel, a rising influencer who'd just landed a brand deal with a luxury perfume label. Didn't react, but that same night I received a message from Lois. It simply said, "Meet me. One last time." I stared at the message for a long time. Ruth was asleep beside me, curled up peacefully, her hand resting over mine even in her dreams. I turned my phone off. But the next morning, when I left for the office, she was waiting by my car. Lois wearing the same dress she wore the day I proposed to her, the one she laughed at, mocked, and rejected. She looked thinner, tired, like she hadn't slept for weeks. "Please," she said as I approached. "Just 5 minutes." I could have ignored her, but something in her eyes, desperation mixed with something else, made me stop. We sat on a bench near the company fountain. She didn't speak for a while, just looked at the water. Then finally she said, "Clark used me." I remained silent. I thought if I gave him everything, proved I was loyal, he'd pick me. But after using my image to boost his reputation, he dropped me the second a better opportunity came along. She laughed bitterly. I left. The man who loved me for a man who saw me as a step on a ladder. She turned to me, her eyes glossy. "I don't expect forgiveness. I wanted you to know that I finally understand." I waited. For 4 months, I thought about everything you did for me, everything I threw away, and how stupid I was to only see your worth when someone else did. Ruth isn't with you because you're famous. She's with you because she sees you, the way I never did. I exhaled slowly. "Lois," I said gently, "you were never stupid." Her eyes widened. "You were cruel." She blinked. "You didn't just reject me. You humiliated me. You crushed my self-worth in front of everyone and called it standards. I would have taken 1,000 rejections. But not that." "I know," she whispered, voice breaking. "I deserve that." I stood up and then looked at her one last time. You always said I wasn't worthy, and maybe, back then, I wasn't. I was too good for you. She looked like she'd just been slapped. But now? I continued, my voice firm. Now, I've found someone who doesn't need to be convinced that I'm worth loving. I turned away. But before I could walk, she said quietly, I was pregnant. I froze. It was Clark's, she continued, her voice trembling. But he forced me to get rid of it. Said it would ruin his aesthetic. That it didn't fit into his brand. I closed my eyes. It was tragic, but it didn't change anything. I'm sorry that happened to you, I said without turning around. But you still don't get to rewrite the past. I walked away. That evening, when I returned home, Ruth was waiting at the door. She smiled at me, held my hand, and whispered, You saw her, didn't you? I nodded. She said it was the last time. Ruth didn't ask what Lois said. She didn't need to. Instead, she pulled me close, pressed her forehead against mine, and said, Then let's make it the last time you ever think about her. That night, I held my wife like she was my beginning and my end. The next week, I posted a short video online. A thank you message to everyone who had supported my career, believed in me when I was nothing, and stood by me through everything. In the background of the video, Ruth walked past in her pajama shorts, humming to herself, holding a cup of tea. People noticed. Comments poured in. That woman's smile is everything. She looks at him like he's her whole world. Lois must be crying herself to sleep every night. Lois didn't post anything for months after that. No photos, no stories, no new campaigns. It was like she vanished. 1 year passed. I launched my own design line. Ruth took over brand strategy, and we became an unstoppable duo. My work was featured in international showcases. Our story was written about in every major lifestyle magazine. We weren't flashy, we were solid, and solid last longer. On our first anniversary, Ruth gave me a hand-bound leather journal. Inside it were 50 handwritten reasons why she loved me. Every page felt like gold. I teared up halfway through. She kissed my cheek and whispered, You've given me everything. This is the least I can do. I smiled and tucked the journal safely away. That night, we danced slowly in our living room, with nothing but moonlight and soft music in the background. No one else watching. No applause. But that moment, it was louder than a stadium. As for Lois, she never recovered her public image. Brands dropped her, Clark blocked her, and every time she saw my face in a headline beside Ruth's, she probably remembered the day she said I wasn't worthy, but the truth is, it was never about worth. It was about timing. And when the right person comes along at the right time, you don't mock them. You don't laugh in their face. You don't throw them away, because one day they'll be standing beside someone else, smiling, loved, and the only thing you'll be holding is regret.